For more than 300 years, one of the most profitable business models on Earth was not invented by merchants, bankers, or industrialists, but quietly legalized by governments that publicly condemned theft while privately licensing it. Because at the height of Europe's global expansion, entire empires were funded not by taxes alone, but by organized robbery carried out at sea. A system so normalized that it blurred the line between criminal and patriot, so effective that it financed wars, paid debts, and built cities, and so morally flexible that the same man could be hanged as a pirate one year and knighted as a national hero the next. And the uncomfortable truth is that modern states did not merely tolerate the system, they engineered it, refined it, and depended on it. Because long before multinational corporations and financial instruments, the easiest way to extract wealth from rivals was to outsource violence to private actors, give it a legal stamp, and take a percentage of the proceeds. And this story begins not with skulls and crossed bones, but with paperwork, signatures, and incentives that turned the ocean into a floating balance sheet, where ships were assets, cargo was revenue, and human lives were simply operational costs. In the late medieval world, European states were weak by modern standards. They lacked standing navies, reliable tax systems, and bureaucratic reach. Yet they faced an unprecedented opportunity as global trade expanded. Silver flowed from the Americas, spices moved from Asia, and maritime routes became the arteries of wealth. But protecting those routes was expensive, and fighting rivals like Spain, Portugal, France, and later the Dutch required ships, sailors, and constant funding. So governments turned to a simple psychological and economic solution that humans have always favored in times of constraint. They privatized risk and socialized reward, issuing documents known as letters of marque that transformed ordinary ship owners into legal predators, authorizing them to attack enemy vessels, seize cargo, and keep a share of the profits in exchange for loyalty to the crown. A system that worked precisely because it aligned individual greed with state objectives, making personal enrichment indistinguishable from national interest. From the perspective of the state, privateering was elegant. It required no upfront capital, reduced political accountability, and converted unemployed sailors into wartime assets. While from the perspective of the privateer, it offered legitimacy, legal protection at home, and a moral narrative that framed plunder as service. And this alignment of incentives explains why privateering exploded during periods of prolonged conflict, such as the Anglo-Spanish Wars of the 16th century, when England, lacking the resources to directly confront Spain's massive imperial fleet, relied on figures like Francis Drake, who did not merely raid Spanish ships for adventure, but systematically targeted the logistical backbone of Spanish power, intercepting silver shipments from the Americas, disrupting supply lines, and forcing Spain to spend more defending its trade than it could afford. And when Drake returned to England, laden with captured silver, spices, and goods, the crown quietly took its cut, paid off debts, and reinforced a narrative that framed the theft as divine favor and national destiny. Psychologically, this system depended on a crucial act of moral compartmentalization, because humans find it easier to justify violence when it is abstracted into categories. And the letter of marque did exactly that, turning individual victims into faceless enemies, reducing suffering to ledger entries, and allowing participants to see themselves not as criminals, but as instruments of a higher cause. And this psychological framing mattered because it stabilized behavior, making long-term looting sustainable rather than chaotic. And this is where pirates enter the story, not as a separate category, but as a deviation from the same economic logic. Because piracy was not the opposite of privateering, it was privateering without paperwork, the same tactics, the same ships, the same crews, but without state oversight or revenue sharing. And when wars ended, thousands of licensed privateers suddenly found themselves unemployed, armed, and deeply familiar with the mechanics of maritime theft, and many simply continued doing what they knew best, only now without legal cover, revealing how thin the line had always been between lawful and unlawful violence. Governments responded to piracy with outrage, not because it was immoral, but because it disrupted the business model. Pirates did not share profits, did not respect national boundaries, and attacked ships regardless of flag, introducing uncertainty into trade networks that states depended on for customs revenue and economic stability. And this conflict of incentives explains why the same governments that celebrated privateers during war hunted pirates mercilessly during peace, staging public executions that served as economic theater, warning others that unauthorized competition would not be tolerated. And these executions were often framed as moral justice, but their deeper function was regulatory, reinforcing the monopoly of violence and extraction held by the state. Nowhere was this system more visible than in the Caribbean during the 17th century, where European powers competed over sugar islands that generated enormous profits through enslaved labor. And protecting those profits required constant maritime force, so ports like Port Royal in Jamaica became semi-official hubs of privateering, where taverns, shipyards, and courts existed primarily to support legalized looting. And local governors often turned a blind eye to excesses, as long as their share was delivered, creating a feedback loop in which corruption was not a failure of the system, but a feature, because it allowed flexible interpretation of legality depending on political needs. And when Port Royal was destroyed by an earthquake in 1692, many contemporaries interpreted it as divine punishment, but economically it marked the shift toward more centralized naval control, as states grew stronger and less reliant on private violence. The Dutch Republic offers another variation of the same logic, but applied through corporate structure rather than individual captains, because the Dutch East India Company was, in essence, a privatized empire with state backing, granted the legal authority to wage war, seize territory, and capture ships, blurring the distinction between commerce and conquest. And here, the psychology of privateering was embedded within early capitalism itself, as shareholders benefited from violence they would never witness, and moral responsibility was diffused across distance and abstraction. A pattern that would become increasingly familiar in later centuries, yet for all its effectiveness, state-sponsored looting carried long-term consequences that governments consistently underestimated, because reliance on privateers distorted economic incentives, encouraging short-term extraction over sustainable trade, and fostering a culture in which success was measured by captured cargo rather than productive capacity. And Spain's experience illustrates this danger vividly, as its immense inflow of silver from the Americas made it both a target for privateers and increasingly dependent on defensive spending, while simultaneously undermining domestic industry through inflation, creating a paradox in which wealth made the empire poorer in structural terms, and privateers exploited this weakness mercilessly, accelerating decline not through decisive battles, but through cumulative disruption that eroded confidence, raised insurance costs, and diverted resources away from development. Psychologically, this environment rewarded risk-taking behavior bordering on recklessness because the potential gains from a successful capture were enormous, while the costs were often externalized onto crews, insurers, or the state. And this asymmetry attracted a particular type of individual, ambitious, adaptable, and morally flexible, who thrived in gray zones of legality. And it is no accident that many former privateers later became influential figures in colonial societies, bringing with them a mindset shaped by opportunism rather than institution building. As naval technology advanced and states developed standing fleets, the economic rationale for privateering gradually weakened, but it did not disappear without resistance, because vested interests had formed around it, including shipowners, merchants, and local officials whose livelihoods depended on sanctioned theft. And debates over privateering in the 18th and 19th centuries revealed a deeper tension within capitalism itself, between profit generated through production and profit generated through appropriation, a tension that persists in different forms today. When the Declaration of Paris in 1856 effectively abolished privateering among major European powers, it was framed as a humanitarian advancement, but it also reflected a shift in economic structure, as states now had the capacity to project power directly and preferred predictable trade over opportunistic plunder. Yet even then, the underlying logic did not vanish, it migrated, appearing in colonial concessions, gunboat diplomacy, and later in financial mechanisms that extracted value without direct violence, suggesting that privateering was not an anomaly,
but an early expression of a recurring pattern in which power legitimizes extraction by reframing it as order. The enduring fascination with pirates in popular culture often obscures this reality by focusing on individual rebellion rather than systemic design, because it is more comfortable to imagine piracy as a romantic deviation than to confront the fact that the largest pirates in history wore uniforms, carried official seals, and deposited their loot into national treasuries. And this discomfort arises because it challenges a foundational narrative of modern states as protectors of property rather than its most efficient violators, reminding us that legality is not synonymous with morality, but with authority, and that economic systems are shaped as much by what they permit as by what they prohibit. In the end, the story of pirates and privateers is not about the sea, but about human incentives under conditions of competition and scarcity, about how easily violence becomes respectable when it is profitable and politically useful, and about how institutions evolve not to eliminate predation, but to control and channel it. And when we look back at this era, the disturbing realization is not that governments once funded themselves through state-sponsored looting, but that they did so rationally, systematically, and with broad public support, suggesting that the boundary between commerce and coercion has always been thinner than we like to believe, and that the true legacy of privateering is not buried treasure or black flags, but the quiet normalization of extraction as policy. A legacy that continues to shape how power and wealth interact long after the cannons fell silent.